A sister is supposed to be your first friend, the one who knew you before anyone else, who shared your parents, your home, the same dinner table. She should be the last person who would ever turn on you. But in these cases, the most dangerous person in the house was the daughter, the sister, the one who smiled through holidays and knew where everyone slept. The threat didn't come through a broken window. It came from someone who already had a key. These weren't explosions of rage. They were quiet plans, built over weeks and months by women who kept coming to family dinners while working out how to end the people across from them. Some wanted money, some freedom, some a partner the family had rejected. Today, we're covering 10 sisters who secretly planned to massacre their own families. What you're about to hear will change how you see the people who know you best, because every one of these families felt safe until the moment they weren't. Case 1. Erin Caffey. On the last night of February 2008, inside a small home in the piney woods of Rains County in East Texas, near the little town of Alba, the Caffey family went to sleep the way they did most nights. Terry and Penny Caffey turned in early. Their 2 sons were upstairs, 13-year-old Matthew, who everyone called Bubba, and 8-year-old Tyler. The family was devoutly religious, and their whole life was built around it, around church and faith, and the quiet rhythm of a rural household that kept to itself. Their oldest child, 16-year-old Erin, looked like the center of that world. She had been raised entirely inside the church. She was polite, she was talented, and she was the daughter other parents in the congregation pointed to as the example they wanted their own children to follow. A few hours after midnight on March 1st, Penny and both boys would be dead. The home would be burning down to its foundation, and the one member of the family who knew it was coming would be sitting in a car parked down the dirt road, waiting for it to be over. The person who organized the destruction of the Caffey family was the Caffey family's model child. The Caffeys had built their entire life around their faith and around each other. Terry and Penny were strict parents, and they were strict for reasons they believed in completely. They wanted their children raised inside the church and shielded from the things they thought could pull a young person off course. And for most of Erin's childhood, that structure held. She was well liked. To the people around the family, she seemed content inside the life her parents had made for her. The good girl from the good religious family in a small Texas town where everybody knew everybody. But what the congregation saw, and what was happening inside Erin, had been drifting apart for some time, and the gap between the two was about to become the most important fact of all their lives. Roughly 5 months before the murders, Erin began dating an 18-year-old named Charlie Wilkinson. The two of them met while Erin was working a part-time job as a waitress at a Sonic, and the relationship turned serious quickly. At first, her parents allowed it. Charlie was welcomed into the home. For a while, the relationship looked, to the adults watching it, like an ordinary teenage romance, the kind a strict family keeps an eye on but tolerates. What the adults did not see was how completely Erin had folded her sense of the future into Charlie. She had stopped seeing him as a boyfriend her parents permitted and started seeing him as the whole of her life. And once that shift happened, every rule of the household stopped looking like guidance and started looking like a wall. The same faith and structure that the rest of the family lived inside had become, for Erin, the thing she most wanted gone. The crack that the rest of the case poured through was small and ordinary. In the weeks before the murders, Terry and Penny decided the relationship had gone too far, and they told Erin she could no longer see Charlie. To them, it was a parenting decision, the sort of line that parents draw and teenagers resent and then, usually, survive. To Erin, it landed as the end of everything. She did not argue her way around it, and she did not wait it out. Instead, she and Charlie began to talk about a different kind of solution, one in which the obstacle was not the rule, but the people who had made it. Over a period of weeks, the two of them planned to kill her family. This was not a single moment of rage that boiled over in an argument. It was a series of conversations and decisions and arrangements worked out calmly over time, while Erin went on living in the house, eating meals with her mother, sharing a home with the two little brothers she had already decided what was being arranged. Exactly whose idea it was has been argued about ever since. Terry Caffey has always rejected the notion that the plan started with his daughter. Charlie Wilkinson, for his part, would later claim that he had offered for the two of them to simply run away together, and that it was Erin who insisted the murders happen instead. What is not in dispute is that the plan grew beyond the two of them. Charlie brought in a friend, 20-year-old Charles Wade, to help carry it out, and Wade brought along his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bobby Gale Johnson. 4 young people, the oldest of them 20, settled on a night and a method, and then they waited for it to arrive. In the early hours of March 1st, the plan moved. Erin Caffey and Bobby Johnson drove to a spot down the road from the Caffey home and waited in the car. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade went the rest of the way to the house on foot, armed with a .22 caliber rifle and a sword. They went straight to the bedroom where Terry and Penny were sleeping, and they opened fire. Penny Caffey, 37 years old, was shot, and then she was stabbed repeatedly with the sword the two men had brought, so savagely that she was nearly decapitated. Terry was shot 5 times, in the head, the shoulder, the chest, and twice in the back, and he was left for dead in his own bed beside his wife. The gunfire woke the boys. Matthew and Tyler came down the stairs toward their parents' room, frightened, and Charlie Wilkinson told them to go back upstairs to bed. They obeyed him. Then Charles Wade went up after Matthew and shot the 13-year-old in the head. 8-year-old Tyler ran and hid in a closet. The two men found him there, and they took turns stabbing him to death with the sword. He was 8 years old, and he spent the last moments of his life hiding from people his own older sister had let into the house. When the killing was finished, the two men set the home on fire to destroy the evidence of what they had done, and they left. By the time firefighters reached the scene at around 4:30 in the morning, the house was fully engulfed, and it burned to the ground, with the bodies of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler still inside it. The plan, as the 4 of them understood it, was now complete. An entire family erased, a house turned to ash, and no one left alive to say what had really happened. The plan had one flaw the conspirators did not know about. Terry Caffey was not dead. Shot 5 times and losing blood, he regained consciousness inside the burning house, and he managed to get himself out of the bed, out of the flames, and across the property to the nearest neighbour's home where he begged for help. That single fact collapsed the entire scheme. The fire had been meant to leave a scene with no story and no witness. Instead, the man who was supposed to have been the 4th body became the most important witness in the case. Terry told investigators what he had seen in those first seconds, and he named Charlie Wilkinson as one of the men who had stood over his bed and shot him and his wife. From there, the version of events the 4 of them were counting on began to unravel fast. When deputies tracked the group down the next day, they found Charlie Wilkinson asleep on a mattress with guns lying nearby, and they found Erin asleep at a friend's house, buried under a pile of clothes and stuffed animals. At first, Erin tried to play the part the plan required of her, the stunned survivor, the girl who had lost her whole family in a fire and could remember almost nothing. She told deputies that all she remembered was the blaze. That story did not hold. As investigators reconstructed the relationship her parents had tried to end, the weeks of planning, and the specific role each of the 4 had filled, the picture inverted completely. Erin had not been a grieving daughter who happened to be away on the worst night of her life. She had been the planner who made sure she was away. The depth of the intent behind it all kept showing even after the arrests, when Wilkinson was later accused of trying to break out of the county jail by digging a hole in the wall of his cell. All four were charged in connection with the deaths of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler Caffey, and the case could have ended in a death sentence for the two men who carried out the killings. What kept it from going there was a decision almost no one expected, made by the person with the most reason to demand be opposite. Terry Caffey, who had survived 5 gunshot wounds and lost his wife and both of his sons in a single night, asked that the death penalty be taken off the table for Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade. He said he wanted them to have the chance to find remorse for what they had done. With the death penalty off the table, both men pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson, who had not used a weapon and had waited in the car, pleaded guilty as well and was sentenced to 40 years with the possibility of parole after 20. And Erin Caffey, the daughter, the one whose forbidden relationship had set all of it in motion, the one who had organised the night and then waited down the road for it to end, pleaded guilty to capital murder. Across all 4 cases, the legal machinery moved without a full jury trial, because the evidence and the confessions left almost nothing to argue about. For her role, Erin Caffey received 2 life sentences. Because of her age and the terms of her plea, she was not given life without the possibility of parole, but the practical reality of her sentence is severe. She will not be eligible to be considered for release until she is in her late 50s. A young woman who organised the murder of her own mother and her 2 younger brothers will have to spend the bulk of an adult lifetime behind bars before a parole board so much as hears her name. The hardest thing to hold in your mind about this case is what happened on the other side of that courtroom. The man who lost the most did not stand up to demand the maximum punishment for his child. Terry Caffey testified on Erin's behalf. Erin's grandmother testified for her too. At one point, Terry asked the court to let his surviving daughter come home with him rather than remain in custody. Her father, who had buried his wife and his sons, still trying to hold on to what little was left of his family, even when what was left was the person responsible for destroying it. Terry Caffey lived. He recovered from his wounds, and in the years that followed, he chose a path that almost no one in his position could have managed. He has spoken publicly about that night and written about it, and he has described the long, grinding work of forgiving the daughter who tried to have him killed. There were moments early on when the weight of what had happened pushed him toward ending his own life. He did not. He went on, and he has continued to visit Erin in prison year after year. But the home near Alba is gone, and so are the 3 people who died inside it. Penny Caffey was 37 years old. Matthew was 13. Tyler was 8. Whatever Terry has managed to rebuild from the ashes of that night, there is no version of his life that holds his wife and his 2 boys again. No birthday and no ordinary morning that isn't shaped by the few hours when his 16-year-old daughter decided that her family was the price she was willing to pay for her freedom. The girl who sang in the church and smiled in the family photographs had sat in a car down a dark road and waited while 2 young men she had recruited shot her mother, shot her father, shot her 13-year-old brother, and stabbed her 8-year-old brother to death in a closet, and then set the house on fire so that no one would ever know. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Erin Caffey was barely old enough to drive, and she had other people do the killing for her. The next 2 sisters were grown women in their late 50s, and they killed their own father with their own hands, then nearly buried the truth as natural causes. Case 2. Mary Beth Tomaselli and Linda Roberts. Every evening in the well-kept townhome at 530 Natingham Close, in the quiet Florida suburb of Palm Harbor, 85-year-old Anthony Tomaselli kept to the same routine he had kept for years. He watched Wheel of Fortune, then he drove down to the beach to catch the sunset, the way he did almost every night, never missing it if he could help it. When he came home, he read his prayer cards, in Italian and in English, the way he had read them his whole life. Before bed, he made himself his favourite drink, a vodka and Diet Coke, and he said his prayers. He was a man of small, fixed habits, an old Italian widower living out his last years inside a life that had narrowed to a handful of comforts. On the night of March 5th, 2015, his two daughters took him to the beach one more time. By the early morning hours of March 6th, Anthony Tomaselli would be dead on his own couch. His death would be written up as natural causes, and the two women who had spent that evening with him would walk away from what one investigator later called the perfect murder. They would keep that secret for 4 years, and the thing that finally broke it open was not police work. It was one of the sisters talking too much to a man she had met at a bar. Anthony Tomaselli had lived an ordinary life. He was the kind of elderly man whose world had grown small and predictable, anchored by his evening television, his sunsets, his prayer cards, and his nightly cocktail. For a long time he had not been alone. He had a long-term live-in girlfriend, a companion who shared the routine with him and kept the household running. When she passed away, the structure of Anthony's daily life came apart, and the care of an aging man with health problems fell to his two adult daughters. That handoff is where the case really begins. Linda Roberts was 57 years old. Her older sister, Mary Beth Tomaselli, was 59. They were not teenagers acting on impulse, and they were not strangers to their victim. They were grown women, daughters who had known their father their entire lives, and they had quietly stepped into the role of looking after him as he got older. From the outside, it looked like what families do. Underneath, the arrangement had become something the two of them no longer wanted to carry. Anthony's health was declining. He had a growth on his neck, and the daughters would later describe him as suffering from cancer and dementia, a man in misery whose quality of life was gone. That description became the story they told themselves and, eventually, the story they told the police. The reality, as detectives would establish later, did not match it. The growth on Anthony's neck was examined by doctors and found to be non-terminal. He was not in the kind of pain his daughters described. Detective Michael Bailey, who works the case, would say flatly that there was no misery to put Anthony out of. What was true was something less merciful and more ordinary. Anthony Tomaselli's health was failing enough that he needed care, and he did not want to go into an assisted living facility, and his two daughters did not want to keep providing the care themselves. The decision they reached together was not to find him a facility, and not to keep looking after him. The decision they reached was to end his life and make it look like his body had simply given out. The plan they settled on depended on Anthony's own trust in them, and on the fact that an 85-year-old man with a medical history is exactly the kind of person whose death a doctor will sign off on without a second look. On the evening of March 5th, 2015, the sisters did what daughters do. They took their father to the beach, to the sunset he never missed. They brought him home. Then they began. They gave Anthony an alcoholic drink, the kind of nightcap he made for himself every night, except this one had been mixed with an excessive amount of sleeping pills. The idea was that he would drink it, fall asleep, and not wake up, and that the combination of alcohol, medication, and old age would read as a peaceful death in his sleep. It did not work the way they expected. The pills and the drink were not enough to finish it. What happened next is the part of the case that strips away any version of this as a gentle, merciful act. When the drink failed to kill him, Linda Roberts tried to smother her father with a pillow. That did not work either, so the two sisters finished it with their hands. Roberts stuffed a rag down their father's throat. At the same time, Mary Beth Tomaselli pinched his nose shut and held his arms down so he could not fight, and the two of them held him that way until he stopped breathing. Anthony Tomaselli was 85 years old, and he died on his own couch in the home where he read his prayer cards in 2 languages, held down by his 2 daughters after the poisoned drink and the pillow had failed to do the job quietly. There was no struggle that left a mark anyone would notice. There was no wound. There was nothing on his body to suggest that his last minutes had been anything other than the quiet end of a long life. That was the entire point. In the early morning hours, the sisters called 911. They told the dispatcher that their father had fallen asleep on the couch the night before, and that when they went to check on him in the morning, he was not breathing. They said they had tried to perform CPR. Deputies were called to the home at around 5:53 in the morning on March 6, 2015. Paramedics had already attempted CPR and had pronounced Anthony dead. The deputies looked around the home and found exactly what the sisters needed them to find, which was nothing. There were no signs of foul play, there was no sign of a struggle, no sign of criminal activity, nothing at all to indicate that this was anything other than an elderly man dying in his sleep. The sisters were interviewed separately, and they told the same story. Their father had been ill, he had cancer and dementia, he had been declining, and one night his body had simply stopped. When investigators contacted Anthony's primary care physician, the doctor, knowing the man's age and his medical history, agreed to sign the death certificate. The cause of death was listed as natural. The case was closed. Anthony Tomaselli was buried as a man who had died of old age, and his 2 daughters had, by every official measure, gotten away with killing him. For 4 years, that is exactly where it stood. The sisters went on with their lives. The death certificate said what they needed it to say. There was no open investigation, no suspicion, no loose thread that anyone in law enforcement was pulling on. The perfect murder held, and it would have kept holding, except for the one variable that no plan can fully control, which is what people say when they think the danger has passed. The thread that finally unravelled the case ran through both sisters and a single man. At some point after the killing, both Mary Beth Tomaselli and Linda Roberts became involved with the same man. A love triangle that put a person outside the family close to both of them. And at some point, Linda Roberts told that man the truth. She told him that she and her sister had killed their father. The Pinellas County Sheriff, Bob Gualtieri, would later put it in plain terms, saying the sisters almost got away with murder, and that the only reason they did not was that Roberts had run her mouth to a man she had met at a bar. On February 13, 2019, that man went to the police. He called the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office and told them that a woman he had been seeing had admitted that she and her sister had killed their father 4 years earlier. What he gave investigators was not just a story. There was a recording in which Roberts described what they had done, saying that they had done it together, and the "we" she was referring to was herself and Mary Beth. That recording reopened a case that had been closed as natural causes since 2015. Detectives went back through everything. Detective Nelson de Leon would later say that the sisters had known their father was dead and had played along the entire time, performing the grief and the CPR and the worried phone call while knowing exactly how he had really died. On March 5, 2019, 4 years and 1 day after the killing, deputies arrested both sisters. Linda Roberts and Mary Beth Tomaselli were each charged with first-degree murder for the death of their own father. The case that had once had no evidence at all now had a confession in the victim's own daughter's voice. Faced with that, the sisters did not take their chances at trial. In April 2021, both Mary Beth Tomaselli and Linda Roberts pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Their defense, to the end, was the same story they had told the deputies in 2015, that they had only been trying to put a suffering man out of his misery. The prosecution did not accept that framing, and neither did the detectives who had worked the case, who pointed out that the medical evidence showed Anthony had not been terminal and had not been in the kind of agony his daughters described. Linda Roberts, who had smothered her father with the pillow and stuffed the rag down his throat, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mary Beth Tomaselli, who had pinched his nose and held his arms, was sentenced to 15 years, a shorter term that came after she agreed to testify against her own sister. Linda was sentenced in March of 2021, and Mary Beth a month later, in April. The prosecutor on the case, in the end, described it as one of the most unconventional cases he had ever seen come together. A closed and buried death pulled back out of the ground by a recorded conversation between a woman and the man she was dating. What stays in the record about Anthony Tomaselli is not the crime. It is the routine, the wheel of fortune every evening, the drive to the beach for the sunset he refused to miss, the prayer cards in Italian and in English, the vodka and Diet Coke before bed. He was a man who had outlived his companion and shrunk his world down to a few quiet comforts and the two people he should have been able to trust most completely. The daughters who had taken over his care decided that his comforts and his needs had become an inconvenience worth ending. They did not find him a facility. They did not ask for help. They took him to the beach one last time, and then they killed him with a poisoned drink, a pillow, and their own hands. And they let a doctor write it up as old age. For 4 years it worked. Anthony Tomaselli's death stood in the public record as natural causes, and his daughters walked free, until one of them could not stop talking about the one thing she should never have said out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Tomaselli sisters were grown women in their late 50s who killed quietly and nearly disguised it as old age. The next sister was 12 years old, and there was nothing quiet about what she and her older boyfriend did to her parents and her little brother in the middle of the night. Case 3. Jasmine Richardson. On the night of April 22, 2006, in a quiet suburban neighbourhood in Medicine Hat, a small city in southeastern Alberta, Canada, the Richardson family was home together in their split-level house, the way they were most nights. Mark Richardson, 42, and his wife Deborah, 48, were the kind of parents the neighbours thought of as steady and ordinary. Their 8-year-old son, Tyler, was asleep upstairs in his bedroom. Their 12-year-old daughter was in the house too. She was in 7th grade. She liked the things a lot of 12-year-old girls liked, and she had recently fallen hard for a boy, the way 12-year-olds do, except the boy was not a boy at all. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Mark and Deborah Richardson would be dead in the basement of their own home. 8-year-old Tyler would be dead in his bedroom upstairs, and the house would be so soaked in blood that investigators would describe spatter on the walls, the floors, and the ceilings. The only member of the family who walked out of that house alive was the 12-year-old daughter, and she had not survived the attack. She had helped plan it. The girl at the centre of this case cannot legally be named in Canada. Because she was 12 years old at the time of the crime, her identity is protected under the country's Youth Criminal Justice Act, and in Canadian court records and Canadian news coverage, she is referred to only by her initials. Outside Canada, in the United States and elsewhere, her name became widely known as Jasmine Richardson, and the case is remembered around the world under that name. Whatever you call her, the facts the courts established are the same. She was the youngest person in modern Canadian history to be convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, and the 3 people she was convicted of killing were her own mother, her own father, and her own little brother. The trouble in the Richardson home had a single source, and it had walked into Jasmine's life only a short time before the murders. At a punk rock concert, the 12-year-old had met a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Allen Steinke. The age gap alone was alarming, an adult man pursuing a child barely into her teens, but the relationship was stranger and darker than even that. Steinke cultivated a persona around darkness and fantasy. Jasmine came to refer to him as a 300-year-old werewolf, and Steinke encouraged the mythology around himself. a grown man playing at being something inhuman for the benefit of a 7th grader. To Jasmine, in the way that a 12-year-old can mistake intensity for love, Steinke became the most important thing in her world. To Mark and Deborah Richardson, he was exactly what he looked like from the outside, a 23-year-old man with no business anywhere near their daughter. They did what responsible parents do. They objected. They tried to keep the two of them apart. That objection became the fracture that the whole case poured through. Rather than ending the relationship, the disapproval pushed Jasmine and Steinke closer together and turned their attention toward the people standing in their way. The two of them began communicating through emails and phone calls, and in those messages, they moved from teenage complaint to something far worse. Steinke wrote about his hatred for Jasmine's family in language soaked in violence, ranting online about wanting to cut their throats and make them pay, framing the family's ordinary parental rules as a wrong that demanded blood. Jasmine, for her part, put the plan into a single chilling sentence in her own writing, describing a future that began with her killing them and ended with her living with him. The Crown would later suggest that the killings may have drawn inspiration from Steinke's favourite film, Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, a movie about a young couple who begin a murder spree by killing the woman's parents. A friend of Steinke's would testify that Steinke had talked about the movie and had noted one difference between the film and what he intended to do. In the movie, he said, a young boy is spared. In real life, the girlfriend's little brother would have to die. The little brother he was talking about was 8-year-old Tyler. On the night of April 22, 2006, the plan stopped being words on a screen. Steinke made his way into the Richardson home in the darkness, slipping into the basement of the family's house. What happened next, he would later describe in court in a version that minimized his own planning. He claimed he had not intended for it to unfold the way it did, that Deborah Richardson, wearing only a nightgown, had come down into the basement, turned on a light, found him hiding in the dark, and screamed, and that the attack began from there. However it began, the violence that followed was overwhelming. Mark Richardson, the father, was stabbed 24 times. Deborah Richardson, the mother, was stabbed 12 times. The two parents were killed in the basement of the home they had raised their children in. And then there was Tyler. The 8-year-old was attacked in the house as well. He died from a severed jugular vein, with 4 additional stab wounds to his face and chest, and an autopsy would later suggest that he had also been strangled. He was 8 years old, the little brother who, according to the testimony, had been marked for death from the start, specifically because he existed, because the plan the two of them had built had no room in it for him. By the time it was over, the Richardson home was a scene so violent that the experts who later testified described blood spattered across the walls, the floors, and the ceilings of the house. What the two of them did in the hours after the killings is one of the details that has stayed with the public ever since, because of how completely it broke from any human reaction to what they had just done. They did not call for help. They did not turn themselves in. Instead, after the murders, the pair had sex. And then they went to a party down the street from the murder scene, an alcohol-fueled gathering where witnesses later said the two of them were seen laughing and kissing, behaving as though it were any ordinary night, while 3 members of Jasmine's family lay dead in the house nearby. The next day, the two of them ran. They were arrested when police found them sleeping with some friends in a truck parked in a school lot in Leader, Saskatchewan, across the provincial line. By then, the bodies in the Medicine Hat home had been discovered. The bodies of Mark and Deborah Richardson were found in the basement. The body of their 8-year-old son was found in his upstairs bedroom. A family of 4 had been reduced to 1 survivor, and that survivor was sitting in a truck in another province with the 23-year-old man who had helped her do it. The case shocked the entire country, and not only because of the brutality. It shocked Canada because of the age of the person at the centre of it. The idea that a 12-year-old could help plan and carry out the slaughter of her own parents and her own little brother sat outside almost everything people believed about children. When the case went to trial in the Court of Queen's Bench in Medicine Hat, the Crown laid out the evidence of planning, the emails, the messages, the testimony about the brother who had been marked to die, and argued that Jasmine had been an active and willing participant, not a frightened bystander dragged along by an older man. The Crown told the court that Jasmine had been given chance after chance during and after the killings to call for help, to dial for police, to try to stop any of it, and that she never did. The jury deliberated for only about 3 hours before returning its verdict. Jasmine was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, the girl, by then 13, wept quietly in the prisoner's box with her hand over her mouth, and her own defense lawyer crossed the courtroom to put his arm around her. She had become the youngest person in Canada ever convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. What happened at sentencing is where this case becomes something entirely different from the American cases of family annihilation, because of how differently Canadian law treats a child. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the maximum sentence available for an offender who was between 12 and 14 years old at the time of the crime is 10 years. That was the sentence Jasmine received, the absolute most the law allowed for someone her age, and even that maximum looked nothing like the life sentences handed down to adults. Her 10-year sentence was structured around rehabilitation rather than punishment. It included a stretch of time in a psychiatric institution, followed by conditional supervision in the community. The framework Canadian law builds for the possibility that a child can be remade into a functioning adult. Her boyfriend, Jeremy Steinke, who had been 23, was tried as the adult he was. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. The same crime, committed by the same 2 people on the same night, produced 2 completely different futures, one a life sentence and one a 10-year rehabilitation program, separated only by the 11 years of age between the 2 people who committed it. In the years that followed, the gap between the crime and the sentence only widened, because the rehabilitation appeared to work. The judge who had presided over the case from the beginning reviewed her progress repeatedly, and over time, he described a young woman who was, by the system's measures, excelling. She was earning top marks in school, posting grades in the high 90s. She was assessed as posing a low risk of committing further violence. At one of those reviews, the judge told her that her parents and her brother would be proud of the progress she had made, an extraordinary thing to say to a person who had been convicted of killing all 3 of them. She finished her sentence in May 2016, 10 years after the night of the murders, and walked out of the system free of any further court-ordered conditions, restrictions, or supervision. She was in her early 20s. She had served the maximum sentence Canadian law allowed for what she had done, and she was, by every legal measure, finished paying for it. She was living on her own, enrolled in university, and could not be named in the country where she had killed her family. What stays in the record is the arithmetic of that night, and the 3 people it erased. Mark Richardson was 42 years old. Deborah Richardson was 48. Tyler Richardson was 8, and the testimony in his sister's own case established that he was killed not by accident or in some uncontrolled frenzy, but because the plan had decided in advance that an 8-year-old boy was an obstacle to the life his sister wanted, with a man who told her he was a werewolf. The family was wiped out in a single night over a relationship that should never have existed, between a child and a 23-year-old man, that 2 ordinary parents had tried to end the only way parents know how, by saying no. They said no, and their daughter helped plan their deaths over emails and phone calls, and then went to a party and laughed while their bodies cooled in the house. She was 12 when she did it, and barely into her 20s when she walked free, and somewhere in Canada she is living a life now under a name the public is not allowed to know, while Mark and Deborah and Tyler Richardson remain exactly as old as they were on the night of April 22nd, 2006. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jasmine Richardson was 12, and she let an older man do most of the cutting for her. The next two sisters needed no one else at all. They drowned their own mother in a bathtub and called it an accident, all for an insurance payout. Case 4. Sandra and Elizabeth Anderson. On January 18, 2003, inside a townhouse in Mississauga, Ontario, a suburb on the western edge of Toronto, a 43-year-old single mother named Linda Anderson spent what she had no reason to think was the last day of her life. She lived with her two teenage daughters, a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old. By every outward measure, it was an unremarkable household in an unremarkable Canadian suburb, a mother and her two girls in a small home on an ordinary street. Linda struggled with alcohol and with depression, and the house was not a happy one. But it was a house, and the three of them were a family. By that evening, Linda Anderson would be dead in her own bathtub. Her death would be written off as a tragic accident, and her two daughters would be sitting in a local diner celebrating. It would take almost a year for anyone to understand that the drowning had not been an accident at all, and that the two people who had killed her were the two people she had raised. The names attached to this case, Linda, Sandra, and Elizabeth Anderson, are not the family's real names. Because the sisters were minors when they killed their mother, their identities and hers are permanently protected under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, and they are known to the public only by aliases created by a journalist who covered the case. They are believed to be the first sisters in Canadian history ever convicted of murdering their own mother. To understand what happened in that bathtub, you have to understand the household it happened in, because this was not a case of a model family destroyed from the inside, the way some of these cases are. The Anderson home was, by every account that came out in court and in the years since, an unhappy and unstable place. Linda Anderson was a single mother battling alcoholism and depression. The presiding judge would later describe the home atmosphere as depressing and degrading, and he noted that the daughters had lived in a level of poverty that did not match their mother's relatively decent income, a sign of how badly the household was functioning. Years later, the older sister would give an interview describing a childhood she remembered as marked by abuse and by the long, grinding sadness of growing up in the home of an alcoholic parent. None of that context changes what the sisters did, and the courts were clear that it did not excuse it, but it is part of the record, and leaving it out would be leaving out the world these two girls were living in when they decided to end their mother's life. What the evidence at trial established as the driving motive, however, was not escape from misery. It was money. Linda Anderson carried a life insurance policy worth $133,000, and her daughters wanted it. They talked about the life they would buy with it: a bigger house, a backyard, a swimming pool, the freedom to travel. At trial, both sisters tried to insist that the insurance money had nothing to do with wanting their mother dead. Their own friends told a different story. Because the most chilling part of this case is not that two teenagers killed their mother, it is how many other teenagers knew it was coming. The sisters did not plan the murder in secret. They planned it over months, and they discussed it openly and almost giddily with their friends, online and in person. They told at least 3 friends what they intended to do. Those friends did not call the police. They did not tell their parents. They did not try to stop it. They encouraged it. They laughed about it. As the sisters were waiting on the day of the murder for the plan to take effect, one of those friends was chatting with them online and signed off with a casual, monstrous piece of advice, telling them good luck and to wear gloves. That was the atmosphere the murder was planned in. A circle of teenagers treating the killing of a real woman as a project, something to discuss and joke about and cheer on. The sisters chose drowning specifically because they believed it would be, in their own words, fast and unspectacular. A death that would not leave the kind of marks that a stabbing or a beating would. A death that could pass as an accident. On January 18th, 2003, they carried it out, and the method was as calculated as the planning. They began during the day by giving their mother alcohol. With Linda's addiction, getting her drunk was not difficult, and that was the entire point. They wanted her so intoxicated that she could not resist and could not fight back. On top of the liquor, they gave her 6 Tylenol 3 tablets, a painkiller that contains codeine, in order to slow her heart and deepen the sedation. Then they waited for the drugs and the alcohol to take hold, and while they waited, they kept chatting with their friends. Once their mother was sufficiently incapacitated by the combination of vodka and codeine, they filled the family bathtub with water and brought her into the bathroom. Linda was so impaired by what her daughters had given her that she had trouble even getting into the tub. The sisters put on gloves, a detail that shows exactly how much forethought went into this, because the gloves were to prevent them from leaving marks or bruises that might contradict the story of an accidental drowning. They had their mother lie down in the water, telling her they were going to wash her or rub her back, and then the older sister held Linda's head under the water and kept it there for 4 minutes. She did it gently and deliberately, careful not to grip hard enough to leave the kind of bruising that would reveal that a person had been held down, and she held her mother under until she stopped moving. The younger sister was there. In a later interview, the older sister admitted that she had used a timer to measure the 4 minutes, watching the clock while she drowned the woman who had given birth to her. When their mother was dead, the sisters did not collapse in horror at what they had done. They left the house and went to a local diner, where they sat together and celebrated. Only afterward did they return home and place the call that the rest of the plan depended on. They dialed 911 and they performed grief, sobbing to the operator that their mother had drowned in the bathtub. And the plan worked. When investigators looked at the scene, they found exactly what the sisters had engineered them to find. Here was a woman with a documented history of alcohol dependence, found dead in her bathtub, with alcohol and codeine in her system, and no marks of violence on her body. The conclusion wrote itself. The death was categorized as an accidental drowning, a tragic but unremarkable end for a troubled, addicted woman who had slipped under the water while intoxicated. The case was not treated as suspicious. The sisters collected the $133,000 in insurance money. For almost a year, they had committed what looked like the perfect crime. What undid them was the same thing that had defined the entire plot, which was that they could not stop talking about it. The murder had been a group secret from the beginning, shared with a circle of teenagers, and a secret shared that widely does not stay buried. Roughly 11 months after Linda Anderson drowned, one of those young people, a young man connected to the sisters, finally went to the Peel Regional Police and told them what he knew, that one of the sisters had said the 2 of them had drowned their mother. From there, the investigation that the original death inquiry had never triggered finally began. Police had the young man wear a hidden recording device, capturing audio and video so that the admissions would come from the sisters' own circle rather than from second-hand rumour. They examined text messages. They pulled the internet searches off a computer the sisters had used, the digital trail of 2 girls who had researched and discussed how to kill their mother. They interviewed the friends who had known all along. The accidental drowning that no one had questioned for a year came apart completely. In January 2004, about a year after the murder, the 2 sisters were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial in late 2005, and the evidence against them was overwhelming, precisely because of how much of it the sisters had generated themselves through their own messages, searches, and confessions to friends. The presiding judge, Justice Bruce Duncan, convicted both sisters of first-degree murder and described what they had done in language that has stayed attached to the case ever since. He said they had carried out the plan with chilling detachment. He said that in setting out to commit a flawless crime, the sisters had instead handed the prosecution an overwhelming case against themselves, and he called it one of the strongest cases he had encountered in more than 3 decades in the criminal courts. The verdict made them, by most accounts, the first sisters in Canada ever convicted of killing their own mother. And then, as in the case of Jasmine Richardson, the sentence collided with the reality of Canadian youth law. Because both sisters had been minors at the time of the murder, 15 and 16 years old, they were sentenced as young offenders. In June 2006, each was given 10 years, the maximum sentence the Youth Criminal Justice Act allowed for their ages, structured as 6 years in custody, followed by 4 years of supervision in the community. 2 young women who had planned for months to drown their mother for an insurance payout, who had recruited a cheering section of friends, who had drugged her and held her head under the water with a timer running, received the same 10-year ceiling that the law sets for any youth, no matter how calculated the killing. Neither served the full term. The older sister was released to a halfway house in 2009. The younger sister was released in 2010. Both went on to build adult lives. The older sister attended the University of Waterloo on a scholarship. The younger sister pursued higher education as well, and, in the years since, has gone through the long process of trying to become a licensed lawyer in Ontario, her past as one of the bathtub girls following her into every stage of that fight, even as her real name remains shielded from the public by the same law that capped her sentence. What stays in the record is the bathtub, and the timer, and the gloves. Linda Anderson was 43 years old. She was a struggling, addicted, depressed single mother in a Mississauga townhouse, a flawed woman raising 2 daughters in a home that everyone agrees was unhappy. Whatever her failures as a parent, the end she came to was not an accident and not a mercy. It was a months-long plan, cheered on by teenagers, carried out with codeine and vodka, and 4 measured minutes of holding her face under the water, all so that her 2 children could collect $133,000 and buy the life they felt they were owed. They celebrated at a diner before they called for help. They almost got away with it completely, and the only reason they did not is that the murder had never really been a secret at all, just a story 2 sisters could not stop telling. Today, both of them are free, both of them are in their 30s, both of them have gone to university and built careers, and neither of them can legally be named, while the woman they drowned lies in a grave under a death that was, officially, for almost a full year, ruled an accident. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Anderson sisters drowned their mother for the insurance money, and very nearly walked away clean. The next sister wasn't after a payout at all. She let her boyfriend stab her mother and her 13-year-old sister to death, and then the 2 of them climbed into a bath and settled in to watch a movie. Case 5. Kim Edwards. In the small market town of Spalding in Lincolnshire, England, the Edwards family lived an ordinary life on an ordinary street called Dawson Avenue. Elizabeth Edwards was 49 years old. She worked as a school dinner lady, a lunchtime supervisor, the kind of job that put her in front of other people's children every day. She had 2 daughters at home. The younger, Katie, was 13, a schoolgirl. The older, Kim, was 14. They were a working family in a quiet English town, the sort of household where the biggest daily concern was getting everyone to school and work on time. On the night of April 13th, 2016, all of that ended inside that house. Elizabeth Edwards lost her life in her home. Her daughter Katie also lost her life. And the person who had planned the events, who had unlocked the door and allowed them to unfold, was the surviving daughter, Kim. She did not run for help afterward. She and the boy involved remained in the home for a day and a half. They spent time together, watched the Twilight films, and ate snacks while the family tragedy remained undiscovered upstairs. Kim Edwards and her boyfriend were both very young, and they are believed to be the youngest people ever involved in such a case in British history. The relationship at the centre of this case had begun the year before. In May 2015, a boy named Lucas Markham, the same age as Kim, asked her out. For Kim, the relationship seemed to give her something she had been missing. She would later describe feeling, for once, free and happy. Her mother saw it differently. Elizabeth Edwards was horrified by the relationship, in part because Markham reminded her of Kim's estranged father, and she did what a great many mothers of 14-year-olds would do when they believe a boyfriend is a bad influence. She tried to keep them apart. She banned Lucas from the house. To Elizabeth, this was protective parenting. To Kim, it became the central grievance of her life. And there was something underneath that grievance that ran deeper and darker than a banned boyfriend. Kim Edwards harboured a long, simmering resentment of both her mother and her younger sister, a jealousy that had built up over years. She felt, by her own later account, that her mother favoured Katie over her, that the bond between her mother and her younger sister had pushed her to the outside of her own family. Police would ultimately describe the attack as senseless and unprovoked. But inside Kim's head, there was a logic to it. A poisonous account of a mother and a sister who loved each other more than they loved her, and a mother who was now trying to take away the one relationship that made her feel wanted. Out of that resentment came a decision that the courts would later describe as remarkably premeditated. This was not an impulsive explosion. Kim Edwards decided she wanted to get rid of her mother and her sister, and she and Lucas Markham planned how to do it. And they planned it carefully, and they planned it more than once. The judge who eventually sentenced them would say that the planning was substantial, meticulous, and repeated. And the word repeated is important, because the first attempt failed. Around midnight on April 11th, 2016, Lucas Markham left his own home and made his way to Kim's house with the intention of carrying out the murders. He had a system worked out. He would come to the back of the house, climb up, and knock 3 times on Kim's bedroom window as a signal that he had arrived. That night he knocked, and he waited, and Kim did not answer. She had fallen asleep. After a while, Lucas gave up and walked home alone, the murders postponed by nothing more than a 14-year-old girl sleeping through a signal at her window. They did not call it off. They tried again. On the night of April 13th, the plan finally went forward. Lucas Markham walked through Spalding toward the Edwards home, taking a route along the town's Coronation Channel, and in his backpack he carried 4 kitchen knives rolled up inside a black t-shirt. He reached the house, and this time the signal worked. Kim let him in. And here is the detail that defines Kim Edwards' role, because she did not lose her nerve, and she did not try to stop what was about to happen to her own family. She let the boy with the knives into the house, and then she went and waited in the bathroom while he carried it out. Lucas Markham went first to Elizabeth Edwards' bedroom. She was asleep on her side. He stabbed her in the neck repeatedly with an 8-inch kitchen knife, and then he smothered her face with a pillow to be certain she was gone. The 49-year-old dinner lady died in her own bed without ever fully waking to understand what was happening to her. Then Markham moved to the next room, where 13-year-old Katie was sleeping. He attacked her in almost exactly the same way, stabbing her in the neck and smothering her with a pillow. He would later say, in a flat and undramatic confession, that he killed Katie because he was afraid she would call the police. Between the two of them, mother and daughter were stabbed a total of around 10 times in the neck. The judge would later say that both victims must have suffered greatly in the last moments of their lives, and that the events had been carried out in a highly deliberate manner. What happened afterward is the part of this case that the entire country found impossible to absorb. The two of them had, at one point, talked about not wanting to continue afterward, a plan they discussed following the events. They did not follow through with it. Instead, with Elizabeth and Katie gone, the 2 young teenagers stayed in the house and behaved as though nothing had happened. They spent time together. They shared a bath together. They watched the Twilight vampire films, several of them, one after another. They ate snacks and drank fizzy drinks. They remained downstairs in the home, watching television and eating, for around a day and a half, while the family tragedy remained undiscovered upstairs the entire time. There was no panic, no horror, no attempt to undo what had been done or to summon help. There was a couple of teenagers settling in for a comfortable evening in a house that had become a tomb. The outside world only intervened because of the routines the murders had interrupted. Kim and Lucas did not show up to school, and the school's attempts to reach their families went nowhere. Elizabeth Edwards, the reliable dinner lady, did not turn up to work, and her partner, Graham Greene, could not get hold of her. Her older daughter Katie was unaccounted for as well. The accumulation of silence finally prompted a welfare check, and on April 15, 2016, police went to the house on Dawson Avenue. Inside, they found the quiet first, and then they found the bedrooms. Elizabeth was in her bed, stabbed, with a pillow over her face. Katie was nearby, killed the same way. The discovery turned a missing persons concern into one of the most shocking domestic murder cases the country had seen, and the shock only deepened when investigators realized that the two people responsible were two 14-year-old children, and that one of them was the dead woman's own daughter. Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were arrested and, on April 17, 2016, charged with 2 counts of murder each. Their trial took place at Nottingham Crown Court later that year. Lucas Markham, the boy who had done the stabbing, pleaded guilty to murder before the trial began, a decision that Kim reportedly took as a betrayal, and the two of them avoided looking at one another in the courtroom on the dates that followed. Kim Edwards took a different path. She did not deny that the killings had happened or that she had been part of them. Instead, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, arguing that a mental abnormality had impaired her ability to form rational judgments, that she had not truly been herself when she helped plan the deaths of her mother and sister. The prosecution and the medical evidence did not support that claim. The jury heard that neither teenager had been suffering from a mental illness at the time of the murders, that what they had instead was a toxic, intensely codependent relationship. On October 11, 2016, the jury rejected Kim's diminished responsibility defense and found her guilty of murder. By the prosecution's account, she remained glad that her mother was dead. When Mr. Justice Haddon Cave sentenced the pair in November 2016, he drew particular attention to how little remorse either of them showed, and to the sheer amount of planning that had gone into the killings. He said the case was, in many respects, without parallel, and he described the premeditation as substantial, meticulous, and repeated. Both Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before they could even be considered for release, the maximum the court felt able to impose on offenders so young. Even that was challenged as too soft, and the sentences were referred to the Attorney General as potentially unduly lenient. The pair appealed in the other direction, and in May 2017, their minimum terms were reduced from 20 years to 17.5, meaning that two people who had planned and carried out a double murder at 14 could be eligible for parole at around the age of 32. In June 2017, 3 Court of Appeal judges lifted the order that had kept the killers anonymous, ruling that there was a strong public interest in the full facts of this exceptional case being known, and Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were named publicly for the first time. What stays in the record is the smallness of the world that was destroyed, and the ordinariness of the people in it. Elizabeth Edwards was a 49-year-old school dinner lady who fed other people's children for a living, and who tried, in the last months of her life, to protect her own daughter from a relationship she believed was dangerous. For that, she was stabbed to death in her sleep. Katie Edwards was 13 years old, a schoolgirl who died in her bed in the next room, killed by a boy who later explained, without emotion, that he had done it because he was worried she might pick up a phone. Both of them were murdered inside their own home, on a quiet street, in a quiet town, on the orders and with the help of the person who should have loved them most. A 14-year-old girl, so consumed by jealousy and resentment that she let a boy carry 4 knives into her family's house and then waited in the bathroom while he used them. And when it was done, she did not weep or call for help or try to take it back. She had a bath, and she watched a film, and she ate snacks in a house with 2 dead bodies in it. And by every account, she was, and remained, glad. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kim Edwards was 14, and she waited in the bathroom while her boyfriend did the stabbing in the next room. The next case moves to Canada, to a young woman who never picked up a weapon at all. She paid 3 strangers to walk into her parents' home, then had herself tied up so she could play the lone survivor. Case 6. Jennifer Pan. In a comfortable house in Markham, Ontario, a suburb just north of Toronto, the Pan family had built exactly the kind of life that immigrant parents dream about when they arrive in a new country with nothing. Hue Han Pan and his wife, Bik Ha Pan, had each come to Canada as refugees from Vietnam, met, married, and worked relentlessly to give their 2 children every advantage they themselves had never had. They had a daughter, Jennifer, and a younger son, Felix. By the autumn of 2010, Felix had moved out, and the household had narrowed to the parents and their accomplished, dutiful daughter. To Han and Bik Ha, Jennifer was the proof that everything had been worth it. She had been a straight A student. She had won a scholarship. She had a university degree in pharmacology and a respectable job at a hospital. She was the embodiment of the future they had crossed an ocean to secure. On the night of November 8, 2010, 3 armed men entered that house, took Han and Bik Ha down to the basement, and shot them both. Bik Ha Pan, 53 years old, was killed. Han Pan, 60, was shot in the head and survived. Their daughter Jennifer was found upstairs, tied to a banister, unharmed, and it was Jennifer who had called 911 to report a terrifying home invasion. Almost none of it was what it appeared to be. The accomplished daughter had been a fiction for years. The degree and the job and the scholarship had never existed, and the home invasion had been arranged and paid for by the young woman tied to the railing. To understand the murder, you have to understand the decade of lies that came before it, and to understand the lies, you have to understand the pressure that produced them. Han and Bik Ha Pan loved their children, and they expressed that love through control and expectation. Jennifer was raised under what has often been described as strict, high-achievement immigrant parenting taken to an extreme. She was a genuinely talented child, a competitive figure skater, and an accomplished pianist. But those talents were not hobbies she chose. She was made to study piano, to figure skate, to learn martial arts. She was forbidden from attending school dances and parties. Her life was scheduled, monitored, and oriented entirely toward a future her parents had mapped out for her. A future built around academic excellence and a respectable profession. Anything less than the top was treated as a failure, and that standard became the pressure that Jennifer, rather than meet or openly fail, decided to fake. The fabrication did not begin with the murder plot. It began when she was a child. By the 8th grade, Jennifer had received her first B, and rather than bring that grade home to parents, for whom a B was a catastrophe, she altered her report card to hide it. That single act of forgery, a frightened middle schooler doctoring a grade, became the seed of everything that followed. Around the same period, she began cutting herself, an early sign of how much the pressure was already costing her internally, even as she presented a flawless surface to the outside world. Through high school, Jennifer earned mostly Bs, perfectly ordinary grades for an ordinary student, and she doctored every report card to show straight As, building a fictional academic record her parents could be proud of. The fiction held until it collided with a wall it could not get around. In her senior year, Jennifer failed calculus, and failing calculus meant she would not graduate from high school. A student who does not graduate cannot move on to university, and a daughter who does not move on to university would have to confront her parents with the truth. Jennifer chose the other path. She falsified her own high school diploma. From there, the lie metastasized into something almost impossible to sustain, and the astonishing thing is how long she sustained it. Jennifer had earned an early admission and a scholarship to Ryerson University in Toronto, but when she failed to actually graduate from high school, that admission was rescinded. Rather than tell her parents, she manufactured an alternate reality in which she was a Ryerson student. She doctored an acceptance letter. She claimed she had been awarded a $3,000 scholarship, and her proud father bought her a laptop to celebrate. In the fall of 2004, she began the daily performance of being a university student, commuting from Markham toward Toronto each day, and then spending her hours in cafes, in the library, or at her boyfriend's place, anywhere but the classes she was supposedly attending. She bought second-hand textbooks. She filled notebooks with material designed to look like lecture notes, props in case anyone ever checked. She told her parents that after 2 years at Ryerson, she would transfer to the more prestigious University of Toronto to study pharmacology, which was her father's dream for her, and in 2006, she announced that the transfer had gone through, right on schedule. In 2008, when a graduation ceremony should have taken place, she explained away the absence of an invitation by telling her parents the university gave each student only one ticket, and that she had given hers to a friend so that she would not have to choose which of her 2 parents could attend. As a supposed graduate, she then claimed to be volunteering at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, working in a blood testing laboratory, the beginning of the respectable medical career her family had always envisioned. For roughly 6 years, Jennifer Pan went to work every day as a fictional person, a pharmacology graduate with a hospital position, none of which had ever existed. Running underneath the academic deception was a relationship her parents would never have allowed, and it was the thread that eventually unspooled the whole thing. Jennifer had met a boy named Daniel Wong in high school, in the school band, where she played flute and he played trumpet. On a band trip in 2003, Wong helped her through an asthma attack, and the 2 of them began dating. To Jennifer's parents, Wong was unacceptable in every way. He was a known marijuana dealer in the area, and during his final year of high school, he was charged with trafficking after police found half a pound of marijuana in his car. A controlling household that demanded academic perfection was never going to permit a relationship with a drug dealer, so Jennifer kept it hidden, conducting an on-again, off-again romance with Wong in secret for years, while she maintained the fiction of the diligent student. As the university lie deepened, Wong became part of its machinery. Jennifer convinced her parents to let her live with a female friend in Toronto a few nights a week, supposedly to cut down on her long commute. In reality, she was staying at Daniel Wong's family home. The entire structure collapsed when one of the lies finally cracked under inspection. Jennifer's father, Ham, grew suspicious of the hospital volunteering because, for someone who supposedly worked in a hospital lab, Jennifer never seemed to have a uniform or an identification badge. According to the account that came out later, Ham had Big Ha follow their daughter to the hospital one morning to see what she was really doing. When the parents began checking, the foundation gave way. They contacted the friend Jennifer claimed to be living with, and the friend told them Jennifer had not been staying there at all. Confronted, Jennifer finally admitted a piece of the truth, that she had never enrolled at the University of Toronto, that she had not been volunteering at any hospital, and that she had been staying with Daniel Wong. After years of believing their daughter was a scholarship student on her way to a pharmacology career, Han and Big Ha Pam discovered that almost the entire adult life they thought she had built was an invention. Their response was not violence and was not cruelty. It was control, the same control that had defined Jennifer's whole upbringing, now clamped down even harder. They confiscated her cell phone and her laptop. They forbade her from seeing Daniel Wong. They demanded that she cut ties with the boyfriend who had helped her lie and that she get her life back on track under their supervision. To parents who had crossed an ocean and worked themselves to exhaustion for their children, this was an attempt to rescue a daughter who had gone badly off course. To Jennifer, who had spent the better part of a decade constructing an elaborate escape from exactly this kind of control, it was unbearable. She was in her early 20s, effectively confined to her parents' house, stripped of her phone and her freedom, and separated from the one relationship that had given her any sense of a life outside the one her parents had designed. It was in that pressure that the lies stopped being a way to avoid her parents and became, in her mind, a problem to be solved by removing them. The plot to kill her parents did not arrive fully formed, and Jennifer's own trial testimony revealed how it evolved through several iterations, each one more concrete than the last. By her account, she first hatched a plan to have some friends kill her father, the parent who controlled most aspects of her life. She later said she abandoned that plan when she realized how real it was becoming, and that Daniel Wong negotiated a cancellation fee of around $8,500 to call it off. After that, she testified, she changed the target of the killing to herself, contemplating having herself killed rather than her father. Eventually, the plan settled into its final and most monstrous form, the murder of both her parents, so that she and Wong could be together and live off the inheritance she would receive. Wong connected her to a man named Lenford Crawford, referred to in their communications as Homeboy, and Crawford agreed to organize the killing in exchange for payment, around $10,000, to come from the money Jennifer expected once her parents were dead. Crawford brought in the men who would actually carry it out, including David Milvaganam. The scheme they designed was not a simple murder, but a performance, a staged home invasion meant to leave Jennifer looking like a traumatized survivor rather than the architect of her parents' deaths. On the night of November 8, 2010, the plan was executed. 3 armed men came into the Pan family home. There was no forced entry, because the way in had been arranged from the inside, a detail that would later be visible on a neighbour's security camera, which showed the men simply walking into the house. The intruders took Han and Bikha Pan down to the basement, and they shot both parents in the head and shoulders. Bikha Pan, 53, did not survive. Han Pan, 60, was shot in the head, fell into a coma, and yet did not die. Jennifer was found by responders upstairs, tied to a banister, physically unharmed, and from that position, she had been able to call 911 to report that intruders had broken in and attacked her family. On its surface, it was the story of a daughter who had survived a nightmare while her parents were gunned down in their own basement. Underneath, it was the cover story she had paid for, and it was built on a foundation that began to crack the moment investigators looked closely at it. The problems with the story were apparent almost immediately, because nothing about the scene matched an actual home invasion. There had been no forced entry. Valuables were left behind in the home, which made no sense for a robbery. And, most glaringly, Jennifer had been left alive. In a home invasion where 2 people had been shot in the head, the third person, the witness, had been spared, tied loosely enough to a banister that she could still reach a phone and dial 911 with her hands bound. As one person who later examined the case put it, if intruders were willing to shoot 2 people, there was no reason to leave a living witness behind. And yet, a living witness was exactly what they had left. Detectives were suspicious of Jennifer's account from the start. Over a series of interrogations, the story she told shifted and contradicted itself, and the pressure of those interviews steadily wore it down. Then came the development that no plan could have accounted for. Her father, Han Pan, woke from his coma. He had survived a bullet to the head, and when he came back, he remembered something from that night. He recalled seeing his daughter during the home invasion, speaking with one of the intruders in a calm, even friendly way, not the behaviour of a terrified victim confronting an armed stranger, but the behaviour of someone who knew the men in her house. Combined with the phone records and communications that tied Jennifer and Wong to Crawford and the gunman, and with evidence that Jennifer had tried to arrange a killing more than once, the case turned completely. The grieving survivor became the accused. Jennifer Pan was charged with the first-degree murder of her mother and the attempted murder of her father, and so were 3 co-accused: Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, and David Milvaganam. The trial was lengthy, and at one point Jennifer took the stand in her own defense, testifying about her complicated adolescence, the spiraling lies that began with her grades and grew to consume her entire identity, and the murder plans she said she had abandoned. She admitted that even she had trouble keeping track of all her untruths, but felt she had to keep the performance going. The jury did not believe her version of events. In December 2014, after the verdict was read finding her guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder, Jennifer reportedly cried uncontrollably, saying that they had not even given her a chance. In early 2015, she and her 3 co-accused were each sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years on the murder conviction, with a concurrent life sentence for the attempted murder. The reporter who wrote the definitive account of the case, Karen K. Ho, had actually gone to school with both Jennifer and Daniel Wong, and she wrote about recognizing pieces of her own strict immigrant upbringing in Jennifer's, while never losing sight of the fact that what Jennifer had done was a horrible crime. The most devastating words at the sentencing came from the man who had survived. Han Pan, who had lost his wife and very nearly his own life, said in a statement read to the court that although he had survived the attack, he felt as if he had died that day, and he described the singular horror of his situation by saying that when he lost his wife, he lost his daughter at the same time. He said he hoped that Jennifer would one day reflect on what she had done and become a good and honest person. He had attended his wife's funeral as a grieving widower. His daughter had attended it too, photographed carrying incense, mourning in public a death she had ordered. The judge described the betrayal as one of the most profound a parent could suffer. A daughter who had arranged the slaughter of the 2 people who had given her everything, over their strict parenting and a relationship they had forbidden. For most of these cases, that would be the end of the story. Jennifer Pan's case did not end there, and its legal aftermath has stretched across more than a decade and is, in some respects, still being written. In 2023, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered new first-degree murder trials for Jennifer and her 3 surviving co-conspirators. The problem was not the strength of the evidence, which remained overwhelming, but the instructions the trial judge had given the jury. The court found that the jury had not been properly guided on the lesser options it could have considered in the death of Jennifer's mother, verdicts such as second-degree murder or manslaughter, and had effectively been pointed toward first-degree murder alone. The attempted murder convictions for the attack on her father were left intact. The Crown took the matter to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in April 2025, the country's highest court upheld the order for new trials and the first-degree murder charges, while affirming the attempted murder convictions. Rather than face a full retrial, Jennifer resolved the case with a plea. In March 2026, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter. She admitted that she had hired men to shoot her father, but she maintained that she had not intended for her mother to be killed. With that plea, the first-degree murder conviction that had once carried 25 years before parole eligibility was gone, and Jennifer Pan became eligible for parole. Her co-accused moved through the same revised process. Daniel Wong was found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter in a separate trial. Lenford Crawford pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. And in April 2026, David Milvaganam, the last of them to be dealt with, was given a life sentence, closing out a case that had taken roughly 16 years to reach its final shape. A 5th man connected to the plot, Eric Carty, had been dealt with separately and died in prison in 2018. Throughout it all, including in the Netflix documentary made about the case, Jennifer has continued to maintain her innocence. What stays in the record is the staggering distance between the daughter the Pans believed they had raised and the daughter who sat tied to a banister calling for help while her mother bled out in the basement below. Bitch Harpan was 53 years old. She and her husband had come to Canada as refugees with almost nothing and had poured their entire lives into the success of their children. And the success they were proudest of, the scholarship student, the pharmacology graduate, the young woman with a hospital career, had never existed at all. It was a decade of forged report cards and a falsified diploma and a rescinded admission and an imaginary degree maintained by a daughter who would rather invent an entire life than disappoint or defy her parents openly. A child who had started altering grades at 13 to hide a single B and ended by ordering the deaths of the people she had spent her whole life lying to. When the lies finally collapsed and her parents responded by trying to pull her back under their control, Jennifer Pan did not run away and did not simply leave. She tried, by her own testimony, to have her father killed, then considered having herself killed, and finally arranged to have both of her parents murdered in their own home, designing a scene that would let her grieve in public as a victim while collecting the inheritance. Her mother is dead. Her father survived a bullet to the brain, only to live with the knowledge that the attack had been ordered by his own child, a man who said that the day he lost his wife was the same day he lost his daughter, and who still hoped, even then, that she might somehow, one day, become honest. 16 years later, the woman who built her life out of lies has admitted to a lesser version of the truth and stands, for the first time, eligible to one day walk free. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jennifer Pan was an adult who paid strangers and kept her own hands clean. The next sister was only 15, and she did the stabbing herself, guided through it text by text in real time by the older man she had met online and planned to run away with. Case 7. Roxana Sikorsky. In an upscale home on Glenmore Court in Plymouth Township, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, the Sikorsky family had built the kind of life that was supposed to be a rescue. Years earlier, Jeffrey and Laureen Sikorsky had adopted 3 children from Poland, a brother and 2 sisters who had endured an abusive early childhood before the Sikorskys brought them across the world and into a stable, comfortable American home. Jeff was an automotive engineer. The family had means, a nice house, a safe neighborhood. The whole point of that household was to be the opposite of where these children had started, a place where a child who had been hurt could finally be safe. On the early morning of October 17, 2014, the oldest of those rescued daughters, 15-year-old Roxana, walked into the family kitchen, looked over the knives, chose a fish fillet knife with a blade 6 to 8 inches long, and carried it to her 12-year-old brother's bedroom. She put her hand over his mouth while he slept, and she cut into his throat. Outside the house, in the dark, her 23-year-old boyfriend was sending her text messages, coaching her in real time on how to do it. This is the one case in this collection where the children did not die. It is also, in some ways, the most disturbing, because of how close it came, and because of who was standing in the yard with a phone. To understand what happened on Glenmore Court, you have to start with how Roxana Sikorsky came to be there at all. She and her 2 siblings had been adopted from Poland at the age of 4, taken out of an abusive situation and given a new family, a new country, and a new last name. That kind of early trauma leaves marks, and Roxana's defense would later argue that she suffered from reactive attachment disorder, a serious condition that develops in children who are neglected or abused so early that they never form healthy emotional bonds with caregivers. Whatever the precise diagnosis, the reality was a girl who had been deeply damaged before the Sikorskys ever met her, and who carried that damage into the home that was trying to heal it. For years, the arrangement held. Then, in the spring of 2014, Roxana met a man on Facebook. His name was Michael Angelo Rivera. He was significantly older than her, an adult from Detroit who should not have been involved in her life. The association that developed between them was deeply inappropriate and raised serious concerns. The fracture in this case is not only the situation itself, it is the failure to stop it in time. Roxana's father, Jeff Sikorsky, was not oblivious. In the summer of 2014, he suspected that his daughter and Rivera had become closely involved, and he contacted the Plymouth Township Police about it. By the family's account, not much came of that initial report. By the time an arrest warrant was finally issued, more than 11 weeks had passed since Jeff first raised the alarm, and in those 11 weeks, the relationship deepened and curdled into something far worse than an inappropriate romance. Rivera, an adult, had taken psychological control of a damaged 15-year-old, and together, or at his direction, the two of them developed a plan. The plan was not to run away in the ordinary sense, sneaking off in the night. The plan was to kill Roxana's entire family, all of them, the parents and the siblings, and then disappear together. When the case was charged, prosecutors filed 4 separate counts of conspiracy to commit murder, one for each member of the family the two of them had planned to eliminate. The prosecutor, Kim Worthy, said it was rare for her office to charge a 15-year-old as an adult, but that the facts of this case, a conspiracy to kill an entire family, were, in her word, haunting. On the night of October 17th, 2014, the plan moved. And the way it unfolded is one of the most chilling sequences in any of these cases, because so much of it is preserved in text messages. Roxana was inside the house with her sleeping family. Michael Rivera was outside, in the dark, on his phone. The whole thing was choreographed by an adult man texting instructions to a child from the yard. At one point, Roxana texted him that she could not do it, that she needed his help. Rather than calling it off, Rivera guided her through it. He advised her on whether the knife she had chosen was sufficient for the job. The messages between them included a diagram of the human neck, instructions to cut it open like a tomato, and a direction to make sure the victims stopped breathing. Some of those messages, instructions for killing her own family, were punctuated with little emoticons. With that coaching in her phone, Roxana selected the fish fillet knife from the kitchen, went into her 12-year-old brother's bedroom, put her hand over his mouth to keep him quiet, and cut deeply into his throat, stabbing him multiple times in the neck and seriously wounding him. Then she turned toward her younger sister, intending to do the same. What stopped the massacre was the very thing the plan had tried to prevent. The 12-year-old boy, his throat cut, screamed. The sound carried through the house and woke the rest of the family, and the interruption broke the attack apart before Roxana could reach her sister or before anyone else could be killed. Roxana and Rivera fled. The boy was rushed to the hospital with multiple stab wounds to the neck, and against the odds of what had been done to him, he survived. So did the sister Roxana had been moving toward. So did the parents who had been marked for death in the conspiracy. A family of 5 had been targeted for complete elimination, and because a wounded 12-year-old managed to scream, every single one of them lived. The plan that Rivera had texted into a child's hands failed in the most fundamental way a murder plan can fail. Everyone they meant to kill was still alive. The investigation did not have to work hard to establish what had happened, because the planning and the coaching was sitting in the text messages between the two of them, a near complete record of an adult directing a minor through an attempted familicide. Both Roxana and Michael Rivera were arrested and charged as adults. Rivera faced 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, assault with intent to murder, and felonious assault. And on top of the murder plot, he was also charged with 3rd-degree criminal sexual conduct for his sexual relationship with the 15-year-old, the crime that Roxana's father had tried to report months earlier. Rivera went to trial in the summer of 2015, and a jury convicted him on all of the counts against him. In August 2015, he was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the attempted murder and the conspiracy. The adult who had stood in the dark and talked a child through cutting her brother's throat. Roxana's path through the system was different, shaped by her age, her history, and the question that hung over the entire case, which was how much of this was her and how much of it was the man who had groomed her. In February 2016, she pleaded guilty to a single count of assault with intent to commit murder, and, in exchange, 6 other felony counts were dropped. On March 28, 2016, by then 17 years old, she was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. The judge, James Callahan, called the circumstances of the case extremely bizarre and described what had happened as a young person being swayed by an older person who had already victimized her. He said he would request that she be held in a juvenile facility until she turned 18. The most striking voices in the courtroom belonged to the people she had conspired to kill. Roxana's adoptive parents stood by her. Laureen Sikorsky pleaded with the court for leniency, arguing that her daughter was still fragile, still in desperate need of psychological help, and that an adult prison would shatter what she called the girl's delicate world. The Sikorskys blamed Rivera, and they blamed law enforcement for not arresting him in those 11 weeks, when there might still have been time to break his hold on their daughter. Before she was sentenced, Roxana herself spoke, apologizing to her family for not being the daughter they had wished she would be, and promising that she would get better no matter what happened. What stays in the record about this case is the survival, and what the survival cost. The Sikorskys had taken 3 children out of an abusive home in Poland and given them safety, and one of those children, under the control of a predatory adult who had found her on the internet, tried to murder the family that had rescued her, starting with the little brother she had grown up beside. He was 12 years old. He woke to his sister's hand over his mouth and a knife in his throat, and the fact that he is alive at all is because he was able to scream loudly enough to wake the house. He survived, but he survived knowing that the person who attacked him in his sleep was his own sister, acting on the text message instructions of a grown man in the yard who had drawn her a diagram of where to cut. There was no funeral in this case, no body count, no movie afterward. There was an adoptive family that had tried to undo one childhood full of harm and instead found themselves living through another, and a 12-year-old boy who carries the scars on his neck and the memory of what his sister was willing to do on the night a stranger she met online decided her whole family should die. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Roxana Sikorsky was a groomed 15-year-old following an older man's instructions, and her brother and sister lived. The next case crosses to South Africa, where a sister and her own brother killed both their parents together on the orders of a boyfriend who had convinced the whole household he was the 3rd son of God. Case 8. Nicolette Lotter. In a comfortable middle-class home on Thames Avenue in Westville, a leafy suburb just outside the South African coastal city of Durban, the Lotter family lived the kind of settled life that violence is not supposed to reach. Johannes Petrus Lotter, known to everyone as Johnny, was 53 years old, a businessman. His wife, Maria Magdalena Lotter, called Riki, was 52, a schoolteacher. They had raised their children in that home, and by July of 2008, 2 of those children were grown, a daughter, Nicolette, who was 26, and a son, Hardus, who was 20. On the night of July 19, 2008, both Johnny and Riki Lotter were killed inside that house. Johnny was strangled in his sleep with an electrical cord. Riki was stun-gunned, beaten, held down, and stabbed repeatedly. The 2 people who did it were not strangers who had broken in. They were Johnny and Riki's own son and daughter, and the reason they did it, according to the court that eventually convicted all 3 of them, was that Nicolette's boyfriend had spent more than a year convincing the brother and sister that he was the 3rd son of God, and that God wanted their parents dead. The man at the centre of this case was named Matthew Naidu. He came from a poor background in Phoenix, a township near Durban, and he entered the Lotter family's life through Nicolette, who fell into a relationship with him. From the start, the relationship was a problem in the household. Johnny Lotter rejected Naidu as a suitable partner for his daughter, and the judge who later heard the case concluded that this rejection was the very thing that set Naidu plotting, that the moment the father refused to accept him, Naidu began working toward the destruction of the family that had shut him out. Nicolette, for her part, was so bound to him that she moved Naidu into the Westville home without her parents' knowledge, hiding her boyfriend inside the house. When Johnny and Riki found out, they were unhappy, and Riki eventually threw him out. To an outside eye, this was a familiar family conflict, parents disapproving of a daughter's unsuitable boyfriend. What was actually happening inside the house was something far stranger and far darker. Because Matthew Naidu was not an ordinary, unwanted boyfriend. He was, in the words the court later used, a pathological liar and a cunning, manipulative man, and he had taken psychological possession of both of the Lotter children. The fracture in this case is unlike any other in this collection, because it was built out of religion and delusion. Over the course of more than a year, Naidu persuaded Nicolette and Hardus that he was a divine being. He told them he was the third son of God. He told them he was a vessel through whom both angels and demons could speak, that he carried an angel and a demon inside him. Nicolette, who spent much of her eventual trial reading her Bible, testified that she had come to believe the family's domestic worker was practicing witchcraft against her, that her own body had been invaded by an evil spirit, a tokolosh from local folklore, and that the spirit had left her only after she first slept with Naidu. Into minds he had primed with that kind of supernatural terror, Naidu planted the idea that Johnny and Riki Lotter were obstacles to the work of God, that the parents were sinful and that God wanted them dead. In Nicolette's own later words, the siblings believed Naidu completely, hook, line, and sinker. The control he had over them was not only spiritual. The court heard undisputed evidence that Naidu had sexually assaulted Nicolette and had, at one point, forced her to drink his urine, and the judge would point to that total degradation as proof of how completely she had surrendered her will to him. If she would debase herself that far to obey him, the judge reasoned, then she would do anything he asked, including kill. Layered underneath the religious manipulation were more earthly motives that the prosecution laid out as well. Killing the parents would give the children a share of the inheritance, and it would clear the way for Naidu to live in the Westville house he had been thrown out of. Naidu had already been stealing money from the family and sending them threatening letters and phone messages. The plan the three of them agreed to was clinical in its intent. They discussed killing Johnny and Riki using a stun gun and a syringe, the idea being to incapacitate the parents and then inject air into their veins to induce a heart attack, a death that might pass as natural. On the night of July 19, 2008, they put the plan into motion, and it did not go the clean way they had imagined. Hardus, the 20-year-old son, attacked his mother first. He shocked Riki with the stun gun, struck her with his fists, and then sat on her, pinning her down for around 15 minutes. They tried to inject air into her veins to stop her heart, and it did not work. While Hardus held his mother down, in the middle of being attacked by her own son, Riki Lotter said to him, "I love you, son." She said it to the young man who was holding her so that she could be killed. When the injection failed, Nicolette stepped in and stabbed her mother repeatedly, and Riki died from the stab wounds, from penetrating injuries to her lung. Then the two of them turned to their father. Johnny Lotter was strangled to death with an electrical cord while he slept, killed by his own son. By the time it was over, both parents were dead, in the home they had raised their family in, killed with a stun gun, a syringe, a knife and a cord, by the two children they had spent their lives loving. In the immediate aftermath, the plan called for a cover story, and Nicolette provided one. She told a detective that she had left the house at 10 o'clock that night after an argument with her mother, that she had gone to a local shopping centre, and that she had returned home in the early hours of the morning to a nightmare, finding her father's body in the passageway, and, after unlocking her brother from a bedroom, discovering her mother's body in the kitchen. It was the story of a daughter who had come home to find her parents murdered by someone else. Like every stage story in these cases, it did not survive contact with the evidence. The investigation, the forensic reality of how the parents had died, Naidu's history of threats and theft against the family, and ultimately the statements of the participants themselves dismantled the fiction. What emerged instead was the truth, that the murders had been planned and carried out by the couple's own children, at the direction of the man who called himself the third son of God. The trial that followed stretched on for about 3 years in the High Court in Durban, and it became one of the most disturbing cases the country had seen. All 3 defendants, Nicolette, Hardus and Matthew Naidu, pleaded not guilty to the 2 counts of murder, but the siblings did not deny that they had killed their parents. Their defense was that they had not been in control of themselves when they did it, that they had acted under the overwhelming psychological domination of Naidu, subjected to what one of their lawyers called extreme coercive persuasion. In March 2012, Judge Shyam Gyanda convicted all 3. He found that Naidu was the mastermind, a pathological liar who had manipulated 2 young people from a stable, middle-class home into executing their own parents. He accepted that the siblings had been so thoroughly programmed by Naidu that they had acted with diminished responsibility, saying he could not imagine how 2 otherwise normal people from such a home could go about killing their parents, except under that kind of influence. That finding shaped the sentences, and it produced one of the widest gaps in culpability of any case here. Matthew Naidu, the manipulator, was given a double life sentence, an effective 25 years behind bars. Nicolette Lotter, who had stabbed her mother to death, was sentenced to 12 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. Hardus Lotter, who had strangled his father and held his mother down, was sentenced to 10 years, with the possibility of parole after 6. The judge took into account that the siblings had already spent 44 months in custody, awaiting the end of their long trial. What stays in the record is the collision between the supernatural lie and the entirely real bodies it produced. Johnny Lotter was 53, a businessman who had refused to accept his daughter's boyfriend and was strangled in his sleep for it. Riki Lotter was 52, a schoolteacher, and the last thing she did as her son held her down to die was tell him that she loved him. Their 2 children were not hardened criminals and were not, by the court's own finding, fully in command of themselves. They were a daughter and a son who had been hollowed out and refilled over the course of more than a year by a man who told them he was divine, who degraded and terrorized and seduced them into believing that murdering their own parents was the will of God. The motive on paper was inheritance money and a house. The machinery that actually drove it was a young man from Phoenix who had convinced a brother and sister that heaven itself required their mother and father to die. Nicolette would later marry inside prison. Hardus would speak years afterward about wishing he had known then what he understood now. And Johnny and Riki Lotter would remain what they became on the night of July 19th, 2008. 2 parents murdered in their own home by their own children in the name of a God that existed only in the mouth of the man who wanted them gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Lotter siblings were grown adults convinced by a fake messiah that God wanted their parents dead. The next sister was only 14, and she helped her 19-year-old boyfriend stab her own mother 20 times, days after that mother went to the police to try to save her. Case 9. Tyler Witt. In El Dorado Hills, a comfortable suburb in the foothills east of Sacramento, California, Joanne Witt was raising her teenage daughter on her own. Joanne was 47 years old. She worked as an engineer for El Dorado County, a steady professional with a steady job, a single mother doing the ordinary work of getting a 14-year-old through the start of high school. Her daughter, Tyler Marie Witt, was that 14-year-old, the centre of Joanne's world and the only child she had. On the night of June 11th, 2009, Joanne Witt was attacked in her own bed and stabbed more than 20 times across the upper half of her body, her throat cut. She had been killed only days after she had done what the system tells every parent to do when their child is in danger. She had gone to the police. She had reported the grown man who was sleeping with her 14-year-old daughter, and the response to that act of protection was a plan developed by her own daughter and that man to make sure Joanne Witt could not take further action. The story begins, as several of these do, with a situation that should have raised immediate concerns. When Tyler Witt started the 9th grade, she met a man named Stephen Culver, reportedly at a coffee shop. He was older than her. What grew between them was a connection that Joanne, at first, did not understand for what it was. In a decision she could not have known would have such devastating consequences, Joanne allowed Culver to move into the family home, renting him a room as a way to bring in extra money toward the mortgage, under the belief that he and Tyler were simply friends and that there was nothing more to it. Culver lived in the house. He was a presence in their daily life, and underneath the cover story of friendship, he was involved in a deeply inappropriate situation with a young person living in the same home, with the child's mother just down the hall, unaware of what was actually happening under her own roof. The fracture came when Joanne found out the truth. Shortly before the incident, she walked in and discovered her daughter and Culver together, in a way that made the reality of the situation impossible to deny. And Joanne Witt did exactly what a responsible parent is supposed to do. She did not handle it quietly or look the other way. She went to the authorities. She filed a complaint against Stephen Culver, reporting serious concerns about his involvement with her daughter, and she handed the police her daughter's diary as part of that report, the documentary evidence of what had been going on. This was the act of a mother trying to use every tool the law gave her to pull her child back from a dangerous adult. It was also, in the twisted logic that took hold between Tyler and Culver, the thing that sealed her fate. Culver was now facing the prospect of prison as a sex offender. Joanne was the witness whose complaint could put him there. And rather than accept the end of the relationship, the 14-year-old and the 19-year-old decided that the solution was to eliminate the witness. They began to plan the murder of Tyler's mother. On the night of June 11th, 2009, the plan was carried out, and it was carried out against a sleeping woman in her own bed. Joanne Witt was attacked and stabbed more than 20 times, the wounds concentrated on the upper half of her body, and her throat was cut. The violence was overwhelming and personal, the kind inflicted at close range on someone who could not get away. By the prosecution's account, it was Stephen Culver who wielded the knife, driven by his fear of going to jail after Joanne reported him. But Tyler was not a bystander to her mother's death. She was part of the plan from the beginning. She had helped plot it, she had been there for it, and the charges she eventually faced included the special circumstance of lying in wait, the legal term for planning to ambush a victim, and of killing a witness, because that is precisely what Joanne was, the witness in the case against Culver. When investigators later examined the scene, they found male DNA under Joanne's fingernails, the trace of a woman who had fought back in her final moments, and that DNA belonged to Stephen Culver. What the two of them did afterward turned the case from a tragedy into something colder. They did not call for help, and they did not turn themselves in. They fled. As they ran, they cast themselves as romantic figures, comparing themselves in their journals to Romeo and Juliet, two doomed lovers kept apart by a cruel world, recasting the murder of a 14-year-old's mother as a love story. At one point, they attempted to take their own lives together with rat poison. The outside world only became aware that something was wrong because of Joanne's absence from the one place she was always reliable, When she failed to show up for work for 2 days without calling, her supervisor became concerned enough to contact law enforcement and Joanne's own parents. Deputies met the family at Joanne's home in El Dorado Hills, and inside, they found her body. The search for Tyler and Culver led south, where the pair were ultimately captured in San Bruno, in the Bay Area, after their car was located in San Francisco. The 14-year-old daughter, who had been reported missing alongside her mother's murder, turned out not to be a second victim at all, but one of the 2 people responsible. The case moved through the courts in 2011, and the 2 defendants met very different fates, shaped by their ages and by a deal. Stephen Culver was tried and convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The adult who had driven the knife into the woman who had tried to send him to jail for what he was doing to her daughter. Tyler Witt had originally been charged with first-degree murder, along with the special circumstances of lying in wait and killing a witness, charges that could have carried a far heavier sentence. Instead, she reached an agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree murder and testifying against Culver, the more serious charges were reduced, and she was sentenced to 15 years to life. At the sentencing, which took place in the early hours of the morning, the people Joanne had left behind got to speak. Her brother, Michael Witt, who had endured the unimaginable task of cleaning his own sister's blood from the bed where she was killed, unleashed his fury at Culver. Joanne's father spoke as well, addressing the granddaughter who had helped kill his daughter and calling her what she was, a murderer who had made terrible choices she would have to answer for. Years later, in 2022, Tyler Witt was granted parole, and she was released in 2023. What stays in the record about this case is the cruelty of the timing, and what it did to the meaning of a mother's protective instinct. Joanne Witt was 47 years old, a single mother and a county engineer who had, by every measure, done the right thing. She had discovered that an adult man was preying on her 14-year-old daughter, and she had not stayed silent, and she had not tried to handle it privately. She had gone to the police, filed a complaint, and handed over the evidence, trusting the system to step in and protect her child. That decision, the correct decision, the one every parent is told to make, is the decision that got her killed, because it turned her into the one obstacle standing between Stephen Culver and his freedom, and because her own daughter had been pulled so far into the orbit of a 19-year-old that she chose him over the mother who was trying to save her. Joanne died in her bed, stabbed more than 20 times, fighting hard enough to leave her killer's skin under her nails. The man who held the knife will die in prison. The daughter who helped plan it, served her sentence, was granted parole, and walked free in 2023, a grown woman now with a life ahead of her. Joanne Witt, who simply tried to protect her child the way she was supposed to, has no life ahead of her at all, and the last thing she ever did as a mother was report the danger, exactly as she had been told to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tyler Witt was 14, and the mother she helped kill had gone to the police to try to protect her. In the final case, a 15-year-old turned on the grandparents who were raising her, pulling her girlfriend into a plan to stab them both to death, with a to-do list written in ink on her own arm. Case 10. Holly Harvey. In the northern part of Fayette County, Georgia, in a suburban neighborhood south of Atlanta, Carl and Sarah Collier had reached the age when a house is supposed to get quiet. Carl was 74, Sarah was 73. They were a married couple in their 70s, the kind of grandparents who had already raised their own children and might reasonably have expected to spend their final years in peace. Instead, in the spring of 2004, they opened their home to a 15-year-old because someone had to. Their granddaughter, Holly Ann Harvey, came to live with them full-time that April, after her mother, Carla Harvey, was sent to prison on a drug conviction. Holly had stayed with the Colliers off and on before, but now she was theirs to raise, a troubled teenager dropped into the laps of an elderly couple who took on the job the way grandparents do, out of love and obligation and the simple fact that there was no one else. On August 2nd, 2004, Carl and Sarah Collier were stabbed to death inside that home, each of them more than a dozen times. The person who planned it and drove the knife into them first was the 15-year-old they had taken in. When she was arrested, police found 4 words written in ink on her arm, a to-do list: kill, keys, money, jewelry. To understand how a 15-year-old came to murder the grandparents who were raising her, you have to start with how she ended up in their house at all. Holly Harvey's home life had been unstable. Her mother, Carla, struggled with drugs, and in April 2004, a drug conviction sent Carla to prison, leaving her 15-year-old daughter without a parent to live with. Carl and Sarah Collier stepped in. They brought Holly into their suburban Atlanta home full-time, intending to raise her through her teenage years, to give her the structure and stability that her mother's life had not been able to provide. From the outside, it looked like a family doing the right thing, an elderly couple absorbing the fallout of their daughter's incarceration and trying to give their granddaughter a chance. From the inside, Holly was a deeply unhappy adolescent. She was using drugs. She was having difficulties at school, and at the center of her emotional life was a relationship that the Colliers, devout and old-fashioned, did not approve of. Holly was in a romantic relationship with a 16-year-old girl named Sandra Ketchum, known as Sandy. To Holly, that relationship was everything. To Carl and Sarah Collier, it was one more thing about their granddaughter's life that frightened them, and that they felt responsible for steering her away from. The fracture in this case is the same fracture that runs through so many of these stories, a set of ordinary parental boundaries that a teenager experienced as the end of the world. The Colliers disapproved of Holly's relationship with Sandy. They were also alarmed by her drug use, and they had been confronting her about it. They told her she needed to stop seeing Sandy. They told her she needed to stop using drugs. They drew the kinds of lines that guardians draw around a 15-year-old who is using and spiraling, and at one point they refused to let the 2 girls go to the beach together, a small denial that loomed enormous in the mind of a teenager who felt that the one good thing in her life was being taken from her. To Carl and Sarah, this was the work of protecting a child. To Holly, it was persecution. The lead investigator on the case, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Jordan of the Fayette County Sheriff's Department, would later describe the dynamic in stark terms. He said the motive was to gain freedom and to be able to stay together forever, that Holly was so emotionally distraught over being forced apart from Sandy that, in his words, she wished for everyone to suffer the way she suffered. He described Holly as stone cold and as a manipulator who pulled her girlfriend into what was about to happen. The grandparents who had taken Holly in to save her became, in her mind, the obstacle between her and the only person she believed she loved. What makes this case so disturbing is how much of the planning was casual, almost offhand, a murder talked into existence over the course of a single restless morning. The girls had been laying groundwork before the day itself. By police accounts, Holly had arranged for Sandy to sneak into the Colliers' home and hide, waiting with a knife, so that the grandparents could be ambushed, a level of premeditation that turns the killings from a sudden eruption into a planned attack. But the final, fatal momentum built on the morning of August 2nd, 2004. The 2 girls had been out all night. They came back and spent the morning down in Holly's basement bedroom, listening to music and smoking marijuana. 2 teenagers in an altered, agitated state. According to the account Holly later gave in court, it was Sandy who first floated the idea that set everything in motion, suggesting that they steal the Colliers' truck so they could get away and get something to calm themselves down. Holly's response, by her own admission, was the sentence that defines this case. She said, "We'll have to kill them to do that." She would later tell the judge that she had not meant anything by it, that it had come out almost without thought, but the conversation did not stop there. It escalated, step by step, into a plan. Sandy suggested hitting the grandparents over the head with a lamp. Then she suggested using a knife. Holly went and got the biggest knife she could find in the kitchen, and then, in the detail that strips away any possibility of this being a thoughtless, heat-of-the-moment act, the 2 of them practiced. They tested the knife by stabbing a mattress, checking to see whether the blade was sharp enough to do what they intended to do to 2 human beings. They were preparing. They were rehearsing. And somewhere in that stretch of the morning, the 4-word list was written. Kill, keys, money, jewelry. A plan, reduced to its barest components, ending up inked onto Holly Harvey's own arm. When the moment came, it was as brutal and chaotic as a knife attack carried out by 2 teenagers on 2 elderly people was always going to be. The grandparents came downstairs and the girls struck. Holly attacked her grandmother first, the 73-year-old Sarah Collier, stabbing her. When her 74-year-old grandfather Carl tried to intervene, he managed at first to pin Holly down, an old man fighting for his life and his wife's against his own grandchild. Holly stabbed him in the chest. The attack spilled through the house. Carl Collier, gravely wounded, staggered around the kitchen island and collapsed onto the kitchen floor. He was pursued and stabbed again and again. Both Carl and Sarah were stabbed numerous times, each of them more than a dozen times over, in a frenzy of violence carried out by a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old in the home that had been opened to one of them out of love. When Holly later described the killing to the court, she did not describe it like someone who had been swept up in a moment she did not understand. She described it like someone who had been there and done it and could still feel it. She said that while she was stabbing her grandmother, her eyes were closed the whole time. She described the blood, saying it had felt like a bucket of hot water. For about half an hour in that courtroom, she choked back sobs and spoke softly as she walked the judge through what the 2 of them had done. After the killings, the plan reverted to its remaining items on the list: keys, money, jewelry. The girls took the Collier's truck exactly as the morning's conversation had begun, and they fled. They gathered up jewelry into a bag and they drove, leaving behind the bodies of the 2 people who had taken Holly in and the bloody aftermath of what they had done. They got about 4 hours away to Tybee Island on the Georgia coast, where they holed up in a beach house. They did not get to enjoy their freedom for long. Roughly 17 hours after the slayings, law enforcement caught up with them and arrested them at the beach house. When officers took them into custody, the physical evidence was overwhelming and grotesque. They recovered 3 bloody knives. They recovered the girls' blood-stained clothing. They recovered the jewelry the girls had taken. And on Holly Harvey's arm, written in ink, was the list that laid out the entire crime in 4 words: kill, keys, money, jewelry. The plan had not been hidden in a diary or buried in deleted messages. She had written it on her own skin. Both girls were charged in connection with the murders of Carl and Sarah Collier, and despite their ages, 15 and 16, both were to be tried as adults, a reflection of how serious and how calculated Georgia authorities considered the crime to be. The case drew national attention, the story of 2 teenage girls who had butchered an elderly couple, the grandparents of one of them, so that they could be together and free. The legal resolution came on April 14, 2005, when Holly Harvey pleaded guilty in the courtroom of Fayette County Superior Court Judge Pascal English. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of malice murder. Because of her age, she was not eligible for the death penalty. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences to be served consecutively, and under the terms of that sentence, she would not be eligible to even be considered for parole until she had served 20 years. Sandy Ketchum, the 16-year-old girlfriend, was also sentenced for her role, receiving 3 life terms for murder and armed robbery, with a parole eligibility timeline that could allow her to be considered after about 10 years. 2 teenagers who had stabbed an elderly couple to death received, because of their youth, sentences that carried the possibility, however distant, of one day walking free. The case did not entirely end at the plea. Years later, while serving her consecutive life sentences, Holly Harvey attempted to challenge her own guilty plea. She sought an out-of-time appeal, arguing that her plea counsel had failed to properly advise her of her appellate rights, and that she should be allowed to withdraw the guilty plea she had entered as a teenager. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Georgia considered her claim and rejected it, finding that her trial counsel had not provided constitutionally ineffective assistance and affirming her conviction. The 2 consecutive life sentences stood. Holly Harvey has remained incarcerated, held in a Georgia state prison, as has Sandy Ketchum. The 20-year mark on Holly's parole eligibility arrived around 2024, 2 decades after the August morning when she tested a kitchen knife on a mattress, meaning that the girl who was 15 when she killed her grandparents is now a woman in her 30s, whose case has reached the point where the question of release can at least be raised. What stays in the record about this final case is the particular cruelty of who the victims were. Carl and Sarah Collier were not strangers who wandered into Holly's orbit. They were not parents enforcing rules from a position of authority she resented from birth. They were her grandparents, 2 people in their 70s who, when Holly's mother went to prison and left her with nowhere to go, did not hesitate. They took her in. They gave her a home, a bedroom, a place at their table in the last years of their lives, and they tried, in the clumsy, overbearing, well-meaning way of grandparents suddenly raising a troubled teenager, to keep her off drugs and away from a relationship they feared was hurting her. For that, Sarah Collier was stabbed to death in her own home at 73, and Carl Collier was chased across his own kitchen and stabbed to death at 74, trying to the very end to protect his wife. The granddaughter they rescued planned their deaths over a morning of music and marijuana, tested the knife on a mattress to be sure it would work, wrote the plan on her arm, and then carried it out with her eyes closed, and afterward described their blood as feeling like a bucket of hot water. The grandparents who gave a 15-year-old a place to land when her whole world had collapsed were murdered by that 15-year-old for refusing to let her do exactly as she pleased. And the last act of generosity in their long lives, taking in a child who needed them, was the act that cost them everything. That is where this collection ends. And it is worth sitting for a moment with what all 10 of these cases share, because the surfaces of them are so different. Some of these sisters were barely old enough to be in middle school, like the 12-year-old in Medicine Hat. Some were grown women in their 60s, like the daughters who drowned and smothered their elderly father in Florida. Some killed for money, like the Bathtub Girls and their $133,000 insurance policy, or Jennifer Pan and the inheritance she expected. Some killed for a boyfriend their family had tried to take away, like Erin Caffey, Kim Edwards, and Tyler Witt. Some were manipulated into it by a man who told them God demanded it, like the Lotter siblings in South Africa. Some, like Roxana Sikorsky, were children groomed by a predatory adult into turning a knife on their own siblings. And some, like Holly Harvey, killed the very people who had taken them in. What every one of these cases has in common is the thing that makes them so hard to look away from. The danger did not come through a broken window. It came from inside the family, from a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, someone who had a key, who knew where everyone slept, who sat through the meals and the holidays while quietly working out how to end the people sitting across from her. These were not crimes of strangers. They were betrayals of blood, planned in secret by the people that every family is taught to trust most, and carried out against parents, siblings, and grandparents who, almost to the last one, never saw it coming until it was already too late to do anything but try and fail to survive it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.